Well, I don't know if I've ever seen as much chaos ensue in a single week of Test cricket for any country on any tour as has happened this week in Australia. From England nearly chasing down a world record score on that last day at Adelaide, only for them not to, and Australia retain the Ashes in 11 days, which in itself was a record, an Ashes record. From all the reports coming out between tests of what England got up to in Noosa and all their shenanigans, from Ben Stokes calling or referring to his side not being a place for weak men, to injuries left, right, and centre for both sides. Pat Cummins, Jofra Archer, Stephen Smith getting vertigo, Nathan Lyon doing a hammy and being out of the series, and then to England coming to the MCG on day one with conditions almost as close to English conditions as you could possibly want, with the pitch having 10 mils of grass, which I don't know if there's ever been a pitch with that much grass, to then this test only lasting 852 balls in total, just 7 better or 7 worse than what happened in the first test in the series at Perth. And it all culminated in England after 5,468 days, finally winning a test match in Australia, the first time since January 2011, that SCG test. But unfortunately, most of the discussions will be around the pitch and whether this was good, whether this was not good, the ramifications on Cricket Australia, and just a wider question about what is a good pitch in Test cricket. Is this acceptable in this day and age? Anyone that went remotely close to a ball ended up getting wickets, because that was just how volatile this pitch was. But special mention needs to be given to Josh Tongue, who got 5 wickets in the first innings, and I think he is making a real case for himself to be probably a new ball bowler moving forward. I think we've seen Bryden Carse struggle routinely in this series, taking that new ball. Obviously, in this match, Bryden Carse ended up with a number of wickets, especially in that second innings. But I think Josh Tongue would be a really good foil for someone like Jofra Archer or Gus Atkinson, depending on who takes that new ball. But Josh Tongue seems to be someone that has wicket-taking ability, probably more than any other England bowler in this attack. And when he gets it right, he seems to cause a lot of problems for a lot of batters. Steve Smith especially, he seems to get Steve Smith out a lot whenever he bowled him, both at international level and I think in a county game as well, which was, I think, the first occurrence of that. But, I think Josh Tongue has a little bit of something different about him as well with his bowling action. And to his credit, when he gets it right, he looks like a real handful, and he bowls at good pace as well. So moving forward, that might be an area England might want to consider in terms of switching up the roles for Josh Tongue and Bryden Carse. But I think it's fair to say, over and above Josh Tongue, it was the England bowlers that helped them win the game on such a kind of lively pitch. It's very easy, I guess, on these kind of pitches to get too carried away and bowl sort of everywhere, hoping that you can get a wicket almost every ball. And as we saw from England's bowling attack in the 3 tests prior, that had been their major issue, was that they couldn't hold a line and length for long enough. They couldn't, maintain good discipline. But actually, in this test match, after a little bit of a wobbly start in that first innings, and a little bit in the second innings as well, they quickly recalibrated and started bowling kind of in the same area over and over again, and got Australia's batters playing at the ball a lot. And I think it's no surprise that they ended up getting the 20 wickets that they needed quicker than we've seen in previous test matches. Again, the pitch helped a lot, but I think England did genuinely bowl with a lot more discipline, a lot more patience, and they all got their rewards. Unfortunately, Gus Atkinson did limp off with what looked to be a hamstring strain of some kind, so we'll have to see how he pulls up and whether he can turn out at the SCG. But I think he was, in that first innings, was the main reason why a lot of the wickets fell around him. He only got, I think, a couple of wickets, but he was so economical, and he was sort of that bowler this England side needed in form, someone that could maintain a good line and length, which admittedly we didn't see enough of from him in the games that he played initially. But coming to the MCG, and obviously the conditions probably helped him, and we've seen how lethal he can be in similar conditions back home in England. So I think his ability to hold a line and length and bowl really economically helped the likes of Josh Tongue in that first innings to really settle into his work and get those wickets. But in the second innings, it was pretty much anyone that was, as I say, going near a ball got the wickets. And I guess you have to wonder how much of it was England's bowlers bowling a lot more disciplined. How much was it that Australia's batters maybe, I don't know if they were complacent, but maybe they maybe took things a little bit too easily, or kind of didn't buckle down enough or as much as they possibly could have, and how much of it was down to the pitch. I think probably it's a combination of all three things. I think everyone will find it very easy to say it was solely down to the pitch, but I do believe in this test England did bowl a lot better. And whether Australia were slightly complacent, only they will know. It's Australian teams generally, you don't really associate complacency with Australian teams, but given the fact we did hear reports, much like England in Noosa, we did hear reports that some of the Australian players did celebrate well after that Adelaide test. Who knows if that had any kind of bearing on things, but it's probably a combination of everything that has contributed to this win. And I think for England and England fans, we saw a snapshot of Bazball actually coming off. And I think the way they used it in this test match is probably the way they need to use it in the future. I think, I think Bazball's batting has been very good when they have a target to chase down. They know exactly what they need to do, and there's almost, not much thinking involved with it. We saw at Adelaide in that fourth innings, they got really close to that target in the end, and maybe it was because they had that target that they could kind of they knew how much time they had, and they had a bit more kind of guardrails to help to support them and not leave them to think too much. Whereas in the first couple of tests, we saw them really kind of struggle to, I think, assess quickly and adapt quickly when they were batting first, for example. What kind of a target was a good target. And I think here in that fourth innings at the MCG, I think, again, we saw that when they're freed up and they don't really have to think too much, that they, this Bazball strategy can come off. So, it might be a thing of England, taking note of this and making sure that, come the next test, it's a strategy they use sparingly in moments where maybe, things are a little bit clearer and you can go after bowlers for a kind of a shortened period of time. Again, we'll have to see if that is what they do, but I think we saw what Bazball can do today. A number of batters do get boundaries very quickly. Chasing these kind of targets, they tend to break the back of it very quickly. And 175 in the fourth innings on this pitch, it was the kind of innings or the kind of target where, you might end up, 30 runs short by the end, and, you might be 140 all out. It was that kind of a pitch. And we saw, even though England was scoring regularly, wickets were falling regularly as well. So, had they not played their shots in that last innings, there's a chance that Australia could have been 4-0 up at the end of it. But, Crawley and Duckett, I guess, did what they've been kind of built up to do for so long. And, again, even though they each only 30 odd, given the context of that final innings, I think that was more than enough to get them off to a great start. But the main batter that kind of caught eyes was Jacob Bethell. And obviously the big conundrum facing England, even before the series and much of the England summer, was, should Jacob Bethell now be getting more of a regular opportunity in this England side ahead of someone like Ollie Pope. And England stuck with Ollie Pope for the first three tests, and it didn't work out. So England, I guess, they had nothing to lose at this point. they got Jacob Bethell in, and there was a little bit of doubt, certainly in my mind, as to how Bethell would go, considering the management of him throughout the year probably hasn't been the best, especially if England have wanted him to play more cricket for England, the England team. There was a lot of time where he wasn't really playing competitive cricket, and he was almost kind of on the bench a lot of the time. So the fact that they were kind of putting him in cold, in this test match, probably the toughest playing condition so far in the test, considering this pitch didn't seem to flatten out as Perth did on day 2. There was a lot of kind of, was this the right decision? Would this be the right decision? And as it turned out, he did pretty well. Obviously, in the first innings, he got a good ball, but the second innings, his 40 odd, I think again, if he hadn't have batted the way he did, England could well have fallen short of the target. But he showed why, I guess, the England setup view him so highly. He looks like he has a really kind of technically sound setup, at least compared with someone like Ollie Pope, who always seems a little bit frenetic, a little bit kind of unsure of what happens outside the off stump. He looks like he is a little bit more compact and a little bit more kind of the attacking strokes he plays, and the positive approach seems to be slightly more kind of low risk and a high percentage in terms of coming off in his favor. So credit to Jacob Bethell. He I think, I don't see how he's going to be dropped now from the England side, probably even beyond this series. I think he's probably going to get a good go in this England side now for a while. From Australia's point of view, it was the bowlers did well. When every total in this match is so low, it's kind of, you'd have to have bowled absolutely terribly to concede and let the batters kind of get away from you. So Australia's bowlers did well. Obviously, a lot of the chatter was that they hadn't picked a spinner. Nathan Lyon obviously out with injury, and they decided to not go with Todd Murphy. I think this was the first test in Australia or in Melbourne where no overs of spin had been bowled, which was a first in tests in Australia. So, I guess that's a wider issue as well in terms of, I think there's been a trend with each Australian summer for a while now where spin is being bowled less and less. Pace bowlers are obviously having more sway, and partly because Australia have such a good, quartet now in terms of pace bowling, but also is it to do with the pitches and sort of how they're being prepared to support pace bowlers in general over spin. Someone like Shane Warne used to say things like, if it seems, it spins. And obviously the movement in this pitch, at this MCG test, it was probably a combination of seam and a bit of swing. I feel like probably if Nathan Lyon or any spinner had bowled on this pitch, they probably would have had success. But when your pace bowlers are getting wickets almost every other ball or every other over, you can understand why was picked. And it's just one of those wider issues, not just in Australian cricket, but I guess just zooming out as well. When you have such extreme pitches favoring a certain style of bowler, does it, is it slowly eroding the value of a different sort of bowler that could help just in general? So it's something that I'm sure is going to be discussed a lot, and just the pitch in general in this test match, it casts a light on a wider issue at the moment, and that is what is a good pitch in test cricket now, because depending on where you are in the world, when pitches like this produce wickets so quickly and matches are over within 2 days, there seems to be a feeling that in certain parts of the world it's just spicy, while in other places it's unacceptable. And I discussed this at length in the first podcast episode, the full 1 hour long episode, which I'll link in the description below. And I have some maybe slightly different thoughts to maybe a lot of people. It's more a case of balancing what is good for the development of players versus the financial implications and just the watchability. So obviously the financial implications are going to be hugely negative with a pitch like this. I think Cricket Australia have already said that they're going to incur significant losses, much like what happened at Perth. And I think the CEO, Todd Greenberg, mentioned that it's just not good for business. From a playing point of view, obviously, home advantage for teams it's something that has been taken advantage of from every home team for centuries, ever since Test cricket started. That's one of the fundamental things in Test cricket, and it's the biggest challenge for touring sides. It's that thing of, if you want to succeed and really call yourself the best, and be the undisputed winner in a series, you have to have conquered the conditions. You have to have adapted and found a way of batting, bowling, fielding, whatever it is, in those conditions, even if they may be really harsh. But when the pitch is so much in favor of bowlers in this case, and particularly pace bowling, but it's the same when it's extreme for spin as well. It becomes a bit of a shootout in terms of who will come out on top. It kind of reduces that gulf between the two sides, if there is one side that is generally is the stronger side and the more skillful and the more disciplined side. Having pitches like this kind of reduces that gulf significantly. It means that at the end of the test, maybe not always, but maybe the best side hasn't come out on top. Now in this case, I do think that England overall played the better test match. Again, with everything happening so quickly, it ended up being a match of very fine margins. But I do think, unlike in the first three tests, and certainly at Perth, which finished in a similar duration, I think where England lost key moments then, I think in this test, England were the ones that capitalized and came out on top, in the various situations, particularly when Australia could have gotten away in their third innings and set a huge lead. They really bowled well and capitalized and did well. And then in the run chase, they could have potentially gone into their shell, having experienced what they have so far on this tour, but they decided to almost play in a way Travis Head did at Perth in that final innings. And I think those were two key moments in this test match that England certainly outshone Australia in. But with the pitches the way they have been in the series at Perth and here, again, that gulf that we saw between the two sides at Adelaide, where you needed to play a more robust, well-rounded style of cricket, we saw Australia come out on top. Whereas, in the two, at Perth and at the MCG, we saw it. We saw the pendulum swing in just crazy extremes. And at Perth, Australia ended up getting away from England. Here, England got away from Australia, and it's fine in that. Sometimes pitches like this will present themselves, and from a watching point of view, I don't know what everyone else thinks, but I quite like seeing pitches like this on occasion, where it is a real challenge and kind of maybe it appeals to that kind of chaotic side of us, where you just want to see some like crazy stuff happen. I do think it's hard to really judge the technical side of the players though in this match. I think with all the low scores, it could be very easy to point the finger and say, well, everyone has technical problems. Everyone has, temperament problems. They can't hang around long enough, as people did in the past where conditions were tough. But I don't know if pitches have ever been as tough in Test cricket as they are in the 2020s. I think it's so extreme now that, I guess batters, sometimes you just have to kind of throw the bat and try and get as many runs as you can quickly, when wickets are falling so frequently. And while some teams or some batters might hide behind that excuse when they get dismissed in kind of ugly ways, I do think on this particular pitch, I think that was probably the only way to play. It just seemed too extreme to really hang around for long enough. Again, I guess I haven't played Test cricket. I don't know, but it just seemed like that on this pitch. Kind of a side point to that is that the wickets that fell in this Test match, all 36 of them, it wasn't always the best ball that was getting it, or because the bowler had done something incredible and had worked hard or had shown, a particularly high amount of skill. It was often that cumulative indecision that was building, given the nature of the pitch and what they were probably what non-strikers were seeing at the other end when their partners were falling, and then when they get on strike, it's probably in the back of their mind. And it felt more like just that general indecision was causing batters to kind of do some crazy things, as opposed to purely the skill of the bowler kind of coming to the surface. So, again, it's that thing of pitches like this can be very exciting. It can produce very exciting cricket, but it's not necessarily a show of skill and grit and endurance that last over 3, 4, 5 days. Hopefully more than 3 days, but like 4 or 5 days. And again, we've seen a pitch where that hasn't been the case, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of kind of inquests into this, and it'll be interesting to see what the ICC label this pitch as, in the coming days, because, as I say, depending on where you are in the world, it seems to get a different reception when wickets fall so quickly. I am someone that, and as I mentioned in the other podcast episode, I am someone that thinks that 20 wickets falling in one day, due to spin, is no different than 20 wickets falling in one day due to pace. I think, both are to do with the pitches helping the bowlers. I know some of it is based on rules that were written a long time ago, but I guess the way Test cricket is changing, the World Test Championship and points on the line, maybe things just have to our thinking has to shift a little bit, and move with the times. But, I personally have not been someone that has kind of pointed the finger in one particular country when pitches are produced in a similar way and then kind of supported another. I think it all falls in the same bracket. It's just kind of how frequently these kind of pitches are prepared, and balancing that kind of skill, and what helps a player develop by playing in a harder batting conditions if you're a batter, balancing that with obviously wanting the test to go 4 or 5 days for the financial side of things. It's something that's going to continue to be debated long after this series, and I won't be surprised if the SCG test pitch is similar, because I think, if I remember correctly, the pitch last year against India in that final test, I think that was also quite a spicy wicket. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. And if that is the case, England, I think, are again in with a real chance of potentially getting another win. When it becomes this kind of sudden death shootout feel to a game, anything can happen at that point. So, I guess if I'm England at the moment, maybe this kind of a pitch is something that helps in their favor. Bazball inherently relies on a bit of chaos and so on. And I know a lot of the language now following that Adelaide test has been about, we've learned our lessons. We've realized we need to adapt. But when it gets to these kind of, fast forward situations where everything is happening, all at once at 100 miles per hour, maybe, Bazball this is the environment where Bazball can thrive and kind of endure and outlast Australia, who do still play somewhat conservatively, even when the ball is moving around a lot. Obviously the tail guys like Mitchell Starc and so on will throw the bat a little bit, and Travis Head obviously is naturally attacking. But, when you watch guys like Usman Khawaja, Marnus Labuschagne, even Steve Smith to a degree, try and bat in these kind of conditions versus England's batters, England do at least keep the scoreboard ticking, even if it doesn't last very long. Whereas Australia, if their batters can somehow get through the tough period, they generally can go on and build a big score, which England haven't been able to do for a while. But if they don't get through it, they would have gone through a period where they absorb a lot of balls, but then don't end up scoring enough runs. And I think that's what happened potentially in this test match. And, England were able to just do enough and outlast Australia on the second day. But as I say, I've been pretty kind of heavy on the criticism, I guess, or the critique of England in the last 3 tests. But, to their credit, they have played the better cricket. Whatever amount of the cricket was down to skill and discipline in this test and not purely down to the pitch, I think England did play the better cricket, relatively speaking. They did win those key moments, and they end up with their first win since January 2011, and you could see the relief on Ben Stokes' face, obviously, but someone like Joe Root, who this England side and the Bazball side, it's a little bit like Marmite or Vegemite, in that you either love them or you hate them. But Joe Root is someone that I think is universally kind of respected, and I think everyone appreciates his skill and what he's done for England through some of the toughest periods of England's Test cricket, in the last kind of 6-7 years. And the fact that someone of his class, as just a batter, had been unable to win just a single Test match in Australia after, I think, 3 or 4 tours. The fact that he's finally got one under his belt here, I think everyone probably felt really happy for him. It's almost kind of like how it felt when Tendulkar finally won the World Cup in 2011 or something, or when Virat Kohli won the IPL this year for RCB. Obviously, those are full tournaments. This is just a one-off Test match, but I guess for England fans who have followed this England side for a while, and it's just been 4-0 after 4-5-0. The fact just they've won one Test match, it's kind of there's a bit of a feel-good feeling, especially considering guys like Joe Root, have been here for so many tours and have not won. So that was a great little thing to see. For Australia, I think really the one main issue for them, well, I guess there are two, but I guess one is you could have a little bit more patience in that he's just starting out, which is Jake Weatherall. But the one area where I think Australia need to have a real think about, I think, is Cameron Green's position in the side, or whether you even pick him, because he's another one of those players, much like I guess a Zach Crawley for England. I think there's been a lot of faith placed in him, given the potential and what he could do if the stars aligned and everything worked out perfectly per I guess destiny. But I think one thing with Cameron Green is it looks like his numbers are kind of going in the wrong direction with both bat and ball. In this Test match, he was obviously demoted to number 7, I think. He's obviously not bowling fully again. He's started to bowl, but obviously he's had a few injuries. I think was it a stress fracture or a back issue, and then a side strain. And I think ask Ben Stokes, when you're not able to fulfill one discipline of the two as an all-rounder, it does make you maybe feel a little bit out the game. And when you get one chance to do your one discipline, maybe there's a bit more pressure on you to deliver. But when you're doing both, you can at least try and contribute in both. And Cameron Green, as I say, his bowling, it's only just starting to kind of rev back up again, but his batting, he's been in this side now for quite a long time. They've tried him at various positions, from 3 to 7 now, I guess. And it just looks like he still hasn't figured out, it feels like he still hasn't figured out his game or his tempo. And I think it's mainly the tempo. It looks like sometimes he gets really bogged down and doesn't, look to score, which is, he's not the only one that has, been responsible for that. We've seen Marnus Labuschagne fall into that trap as well quite a bit, and Usman Khawaja. But, Cameron Green, given he bats a bit lower down, and maybe when the ball is a little older, you might think he would go for a few more shots, but he hasn't. And sometimes he's ended up tentatively pushing outside the off stump and nicking off. And then in this series, I think at the Gabba, there was a dismissal where he almost went into one-day mode and ended up backing away too much and getting bowled. And then today as well, he seemed to be kind of on the move while trying to score. And again, on this pitch, maybe you could be forgiven a little bit because maybe that was the best way to try and score some runs. But it was just another entry into that catalogue now of dismissals from Green or innings from Green where it just doesn't look like he's figured out. He hasn't figured out test match batting yet. And I think for Australia, they'll have to weigh up, potential versus form. Obviously, Bo Webster was overlooked for this series. I guess when Cam Green started bowling again, Bo Webster's services were no longer needed in the Australian selectors' eyes, or the captain's eyes. But he was probably Australia's most informed, consistent player during this year, and I think probably this Australian side would be stronger at the moment if Bo Webster came back in. I think he feels well, just as well as Cameron Green, but as far as form goes, his batting was he was scoring crucial runs in tough conditions in a range of places. The West Indies, in the World Test final against South Africa, against India last year, in Australia on a couple of tough pitches. And, I don't think he had done anything wrong really to be left out. And if the SCG pitch is potentially going to be as spicy as what we saw at the MCG, his bowling could end up being quite threatening as well. He may not get a bowl necessarily if Australia have their, 3 other quicks or 4 other quicks. But, his bowling is something that could become quite threatening if they need it. But I do think that, Australia have a decision to make on Cameron Green, not a definitive, deciding on his career because he's still really young, but I think he could probably benefit from a little bit of time out of the test team to figure things out and maybe give Bo Webster, the chance that he deserved to build on, what he had produced earlier on in the year. But at the end of it all, England have managed to get on the board finally after 14, nearly 15 years of hurt in Australia. As I say, it's many England fans will argue that this is why there was so much faith and so much hype about this England side, because they could break that drought, and as we've seen today, and there'll always be that among England fans sort of that what if feeling, but it's recognizing when to do what at what time, and that's going to be England's biggest challenge moving forward. But I think they've shown in the last 4 days of cricket that they've played on this tour that there is something there for them to work with beyond this tour as well. So we'll have to see how things go at the SCG. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed my test review of the MCG test. Only 2 days, but a lot happened. Let me know what you think about the pitch. And until the SCG test, take care and a Happy New Year.